Hey Psychology, so here we are. It's your first flipped video. This is something a little bit different for me this year, and I'm pretty positive it's going to be something a little different for you. But the bottom line is this is going to only enhance our class time and give us all an opportunity to dig a little deeper into psychology and make it a little more fun and relevant. And that's going to make it a better year for all of us, myself included. So you should already have some paper out to take notes, or you've printed out a copy of the guided notes that I've posted on your Google Classroom. So do what you need to do to get started. Hit pause if you need to go take care of that. And here we go. So we need to start our study of psychology and look at the scientific foundations of psychology. What are the different perspectives? Where did psychology get its beginnings? How old is psychology? All of these questions. We just need to kind of set the basis for the year in our study of psychology. So as we look at just the word psychology and we break it into the different parts, and we look at the word psyche and we look at ology, you're probably familiar with the term ology, meaning the study of, but the word psyche, I think, kind of lends itself and gives you a better perspective of just what psychology is. And the Latin root, psyche, actually means the soul. And psychology is the study of the soul. And it's kind of a beautiful word when you think about a person's soul. And your soul is made up of your emotions and your experiences, and some of those are good and bad. Why did all of that happen? How did it happen? What was the impact on a person? And so as we study this throughout the year, kind of reflect back on that, remember what psychology really means, and that will help maybe give you a little more understanding and a bigger picture of what the study of psychology really is. So on a more academic level, we need to understand the definition of psychology, and that is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. The scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So we know in science that you have to make things verifiable. You can't just say something is true and it is true. Not in science. You have to make predictions and you have to make sure that it can be verified. And that's what makes it a science. So we're looking at the science of behavior. And what is a behavior? A behavior is something that you can observe. So behavior would be an observable act. And then psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So your mental processes include the storing, recalling, and the using of information and feelings. And so this is what psychology is, the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So one of the things that people wonder sometimes, or they ask, is how can psychology be a social science? You know, if it's a science, how is it different from other social sciences like government or sociology? And a couple of things. Social sciences are the sciences that deal with people. And so that is how psychology can fit into the social sciences. But unlike sociology or government, psychology focuses on the individual and looking at individual behavior. Psychology is made up of philosophical beliefs. It's made up of physiology, and it's very important to understand biological functions, how the brain works, all of those processes, your nervous system, your sensations, all of that is going to contribute to understanding individuals' behavior. As a science, it's a relatively new science. It officially, I guess you could say, had its beginnings around 1879, but people were curious and trying to figure out individual behavior for a really long time. So let's take a look at what some of these early points of view, what they centered around. And as we go through our study of psychology, we're going to use the term nature versus nurture quite a bit. And so I'm going to explain what those terms mean and how they can be applied to human behavior. So starting with the nature point of view, that centers around the idea that we are born the way we are. We are born this way. Our genes, our DNA, our hormones, all of that together contributes to our behavior. Our biology determines our behavior. And some early philosophers by the name of Plato and Socrates, they subscribed to the point of view that our genetics, our DNA, our hormones are responsible for our behavior. On the other side of this, you have people like Aristotle, who believed that our environment is what determines our behavior. So our experience, our life experience, how we were raised, the neighborhoods that we grew up in, those are the types of things, according to Aristotle early on, that would determine our behavior. So these are the differences between nature versus nurture. So those philosophers, they were around a really long time ago. And we're going to go for a span of almost 2,000 years, and there's really nothing else happening because the church is kind of in charge of things, and they're running the show, and they're dictating how people are going to believe and how they attribute our behavior, what causes it, the reasoning for it. And then we start to see this shift, and the Renaissance changes things. And then we begin to see the emergence of psychology as an actual study and a science. And that's where a man by the name of Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt, where he comes in. And in 1879, that year that I said that all of this started, he opened his first psychology lab at a university in Germany. And his focus is on what we would call our consciousness. So somewhere in your mind. And he wanted to find out what the elements were of this process and how our sensations and our feelings are connected. And so collectively, what Wundt would call this is he named it what we now know in psychology. We refer to that as structuralism. And structuralism focuses a lot on what we call sensation and perception, and breaking down those sensations and those perception into minute details. And we could call that the structure of the mind. What is going on in there? In the belief of structuralism, you have to understand the elements of the mind, but in order to do that, it requires the person to do something called introspection and to go within themselves, introspection, inside of themselves, to figure out what is happening in those structures inside your mind. But here's the thing. There were people who didn't buy into that point of view. And the reality was, every individual is different. And structuralism is actually foolish to search for some of those common elements. And so this is where another early psychologist enters the field, and his name is William James. And he actually wrote the first textbook about psychology. And what his point of view and his study became known as was what we call functionalism. And the reality is that everything that is in our mind, in our conscious mind, it's constantly changing. And we really can't cut it up into pieces and say that this is the structure of the mind, this is how it's working, because everybody approaches things and thinks about things in a very different way. So let's maybe look at a couple of different ideas here, functionalism and structuralism, and we're going to use the idea of SALT. Let's look at SALT using these perspectives. So functionalism, we attribute that to William James. Functionalism is going to look more at the uses for salt. What do we use salt for? Well, it makes food taste better, and it helps us preserve food. A structuralist, however, Wilhelm Wundt, one of his students, Tishner, a structuralist would look at the components and the parts of salt. We know that salt is made of sodium chloride. And then what is the experience of that component or part? How does that happen? Let's break it down. And that is how we can understand functionalism and structuralism. We can add another point of view here in terms of the early foundations of psychology, and we're going to call this Gestalt psychology. Gestalt. And in Gestalt psychology, the whole is greater than the little parts. Okay, do you look at the whole picture, or are you looking at the individual elements? And in Gestalt psychology, the focus is on the whole experience. And if you take a look at this picture here, when you first look at it, it looks like a picture of a man. And then you look a little closer and suddenly you start to see all of those smaller details. And this is an example of Gestalt perspective. So a couple other details here. As we study psychology and we begin to look at especially things like ethics and how we approach psychology, they have sort of a overall organization that oversees everything that happens in the world of psychology, and it's called the American Psychological Association, or the APA. And their mission is to advance the study of psychology and improve people's lives. It's the largest organization for psychology in the entire world. And they actually, on a side note, some of you, when you get to college someday, you may be asked to write your papers in APA format, that MLA format that you've written for many, many years. When you get to college, I have news for you. There is a lot of majors that require APA. You'll get the hang of it. You'll be fine. So as we're finishing up this video here, we need to look at the different subfields and the ways that psychology, how it is used in the real world. So you can see all of the different subfields. Okay, psychology is kind of the overriding concept, but within psychology, there are people who study development, there are people who study biology, social psychology, there are people that do research and experiment. So you can see all of these different subfields, and many times they overlap and they use each other's information because it is a social science and we're talking about people and they all relate to one another. Applied psychology is really how can you take the concept of psychology and put it into practice. So for the most part, most psychology is, the purpose of it is to go into what we call clinical psychology. And people in clinical psychology are making diagnoses of people and trying to determine what their problems might be. Another large portion of psychology, people are focusing on counseling others and therapy. And then in the educational realm and the workplace, psychology is also a relevant and important part of those different sectors of society. So just to be sure that you understand what these different subfields, what they do. So clinical psychology is going to study, assess, and treat people with disorders. The counseling subfield helps people cope with their challenges. Educational psychologists are helping people in the school setting. And it could be students or even teachers that have had some type of trauma or difficulty. Educational psychologists also are very involved in determining if students have learning disabilities and need extra support. And then any place you work, depending on the size of your company, it's important to have people who are there to provide assistance and to understand maybe how to make productivity increase. That is actually the role of an industrial or organizational psychologist. And that's a growing field in psychology for sure. So you can see here kind of the breakdown if you were to get a certificate or a degree that allowed you to go into the field of psychology. You can see the different types of workplaces where you might get a job. And then finally, we need to make one last distinction, and that's between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist, a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So a clinical psychologist is going to study, assess, and treat troubled people in therapy. A psychiatrist, on the other hand, they are an actual medical doctor. They've gone to med school. They've gone for many, many years, and they actually treat patients with medicine and different therapies, and very often these are individuals with very severe mental illnesses, and many times they are actually in-house. They are staying in a hospital for treatment. So a psychologist is not a medical doctor. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor. And there you have it. We're going to stop here because this is where we'll get going for our next video. So you did it. You finished your very first flipped classroom video for psychology. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.